The silence in the house after Richard died was not a peaceful thing. It was an active presence, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered sound and stole the warmth from the rooms. For 47 years, this house had been a symphony of our life together. The murmur of the television, the clatter of pots from the kitchen, his booming laugh, my quiet humming. Now, it was a museum of echoes, and I was its solitary, tired curator. I spent my days dusting memories, polishing surfaces that only reflected my own loneliness back at me. The weight of it all settled in my bones, a deep, persistent ache that had nothing to do with my 68 years and everything to do with being the last one left in a life built for two. My son, Mark, and his wife, Brenda, had decided I was no longer capable of managing this silence on my own. It was a decision they made for me, presented as an act of profound generosity and concern. They would move in, they announced one Sunday over a roast chicken I had dutifully prepared. They would take care of me, a phrase that sounded less like a promise and more like a sentence. I did not object. In the raw, early days of grief, I had lost the strength to advocate for my own desires. The thought of arguing, of insisting on my own competence, was more exhausting than the thought of their constant, intrusive presence. So I acquiesced, nodding numbly as they laid out their plans for my life, my home, which was now to become their house. They arrived with an avalanche of boxes and an air of proprietary conquest. Brenda, in particular, moved through the halls with the brisk, efficient energy of a new regime taking power. My things were reorganized. Richard's favorite armchair, its worn leather a perfect cradle of his absence, was moved to the attic because it clashed with the new color scheme. The new color scheme was a sterile landscape of grays and beiges, colors that absorbed light and offered no comfort. Mark, my son, my only child, was a willing lieutenant in this quiet coup. He would pat my hand and say things like, "Brenda just has such a good eye, Mom. The place will look fantastic." He did not seem to notice that the place he was talking about was the repository of my entire adult life. He did not see the erasure, only the improvement. I became a ghost in my own home, a polite, smiling phantom they could direct to a chair and then forget. My days, once filled with the small, important rituals of managing a household, were now empty. Brenda did the cooking, insisting my methods were outdated and my diet needed modernizing. Mark handled the bills, telling me not to worry my pretty little head about it. They had taken my purpose and called it a burden from which they had kindly freed me. I would sit in the living room, a room I had designed piece by piece with Richard, and listen to the sounds of their life, their phone calls, their television shows, their arguments whispered behind closed doors, and feel like an intruder. The loneliness I had felt when I was truly alone was a clean, sharp pain. This new loneliness, the kind you feel in a crowd, was a dull, suffocating fog. My only true comfort was Chloe, my granddaughter. At 16, she possessed an emotional intelligence that seemed to have skipped her father's generation entirely. She was the only one who seemed to see me. She would find me in my room, where I often retreated, and sit on the edge of my bed. She would not offer platitudes or suffocating pity. She would simply ask, "Tell me about Granddad today, Nana." And I would. I would tell her about the day he proposed, about the terrible wallpaper in our first apartment, about the way he always sang off-key in the car. In those moments with Chloe, the heavy blanket of silence would lift, and a small, warm pocket of air and light would return. She was the keeper of my stories, the only other person in that house who seemed to understand that a life is built of more than just walls and furniture. Then came Thanksgiving. The house, already feeling crowded with the three of us, was set to burst with the arrival of Brenda's extended family. Cousins and aunts and uncles I had never met were descending, drawn by Brenda's enthusiastic invitations to our new place. She had been preparing for weeks, a general marshaling her troops for a grand campaign. The house was scrubbed, polished, and decorated to within an inch of its life. The scent of pine and cinnamon, once a comfort, now smelled artificial and cloying. I was a peripheral figure in all of this, an inconvenient piece of old furniture that had to be worked around. The day arrived, a flurry of noise and motion. People filled the rooms, their loud, cheerful voices bouncing off the newly painted gray walls. Brenda was in her element, a hostess queen, accepting compliments on the house, on the food, on her crate and barrel table settings. Mark trailed in her wake, a proud consort refilling glasses and laughing at jokes. I tried to make myself useful in the kitchen, my kitchen, but Brenda shooed me out with a bright, false smile. "Everything is handled, Eleanor. Just go and relax, mingle." But there was no one to mingle with. Her family looked through me, their eyes sliding past the old woman in the corner to find their vibrant, successful hostess. Chloe found me, as she always did. She brought me a glass of water and a small plate of cheese and crackers. "It's a bit of a zoo, huh?" she whispered, her eyes rolling in a way that was so familiar, so much like my own. We stood in the corner of the dining room, a small island of quiet in the sea of noise, and for a few minutes I felt anchored. She was my proof that I was still here, still visible. Then it was time for dinner. Brenda clapped her hands, a sharp, imperious sound that cut through the chatter. "Everyone, find your seats. Dinner is served." People began to move towards the long, beautifully set dining table. I started to move toward my usual chair, the one at the head of the table opposite where Richard had always sat. It was a seat of honor, a seat I had occupied for decades. Brenda intercepted me, her hand landing on my arm. Her grip was surprisingly firm, her nails digging slightly into my skin. Her smile was wide, a perfect painted slash of crimson. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice a stage whisper meant to sound conspiratorial and kind. "There's been a little change of plans with the seating." I looked at her, confused. I looked at the table, where her family was already settling in, their name cards marking their places. My name card was not there. Mark was standing nearby, studiously avoiding my gaze, his attention suddenly fixated on a speck of lint on his sweater. "It's just so crowded in here," Brenda continued, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "We have so many people, and I just couldn't squeeze another chair in. You understand?" She gestured vaguely toward the back of the house, toward the door that led to the utility room and then the garage. "We've set up a lovely little spot for you out there. It's much quieter. You'll be more comfortable." The words hung in the air between us. I felt the blood drain from my face. I heard the roaring in my ears that always accompanied a deep shock. I looked past her, searching for my son's face, a plea in my eyes. "Say something. Stop this." He finally looked up, his expression a miserable mixture of shame and cowardice. He gave a tiny, helpless shrug, as if his mother being banished from the family table was a matter of cosmic fate, entirely beyond his control. And then Brenda delivered the final clean, killing blow. She leaned in closer, her perfume cloying and sweet. "You'll eat in the garage," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a statement of fact, a decree. Then she smiled, a triumphant, brilliant smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. She thought she was solving a problem, neatly tucking away an inconvenience. She had no idea what she had just done. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know the woman who had built this family from nothing, the woman who had stood by a husband through sickness and health, the woman who had raised the very man who now stood by and watched her be discarded like rubbish. She smiled, and in the face of that smile, something deep inside me shifted. I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply smiled back, a small, tight, quiet smile of my own. "Of course," I said, my voice even. "How thoughtful of you." She didn't know that my smile was not one of acquiescence. It was the first glimmer of a terrible, dawning clarity. The garage was cold. A damp concrete chill seeped up through the soles of my sensible shoes. They had, as promised, set up a card table and a single folding chair. It was wedged between a stack of bald tires and Richard's old lawnmower, which was draped in a dusty tarp. A single bare bulb overhead cast a harsh yellow light on the scene. My place setting was a paper plate, plastic cutlery, and a can of soda. From the main house, I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses, a distant party on another planet. I sat down on the cold metal chair and stared at the peeling paint on the opposite wall. The shock had receded, replaced by a strange and unnerving calm. The garage incident wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom. It was the logical conclusion of 100 smaller slights, 1,000 moments of being overlooked, of being made to feel small and irrelevant in my own home. My son's cowardice, Brenda's casual cruelty, these were not new developments. I had simply refused to see them for what they were. I had been making excuses, telling myself it was grief or stress or a generational difference. I was wrong. It was malice. It was greed. It was a profound and bottomless disrespect. In the days that followed, I became a quiet observer. I moved through the house with my usual placid demeanor, but my eyes were open for the first time in a long while. I started noticing things, the hushed conversations that abruptly stopped the moment I entered a room, the way Brenda would quickly close her laptop, a flicker of annoyance on her face, the sheer volume of packages that arrived daily, filled with designer clothes for her and expensive electronics for Mark. I knew Mark's salary. He was a mid-level manager at a respectable but not exceptionally lucrative firm. There was a disconnect between their income and their expenditures, a chasm that had been right in front of me all along. I just hadn't been looking. I began to recall small, unsettling details from the past year. During Richard's final months, when he was so weak and confused, Mark had taken over the finances completely. He had brought stacks of documents for Richard to sign, guiding his trembling hand. "Just trust me, Dad," he'd said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "It's just standard procedure for the estate planning." At the time, I had seen it as a son's devotion. Now, viewed through the harsh fluorescent light of the garage, it looked like something else entirely. I remembered Brenda complaining about the dreadful state of our savings, even though Richard and I had always been meticulous, frugal people. We had built a comfortable nest egg, a legacy we intended to pass down. Where had it gone? I decided to start with a simple question. I waited for an evening when Brenda was out at her book club. Mark was in the den, watching a football game. I brought him a cup of tea, a gesture from the old me, the compliant, caretaking mother. He smiled, distracted. "Thanks, Mom." I sat down in the armchair opposite him. I let the silence stretch for a moment, listening to the announcer's frantic play-by-play. "Mark," I began, my voice deliberately soft and tentative. "I was just thinking about the household budget. The property taxes are due soon, and I wanted to make sure we had everything in order." His body tensed. He muted the television and turned to face me, his expression shifting into one of solicitous concern. "Mom, we've talked about this. You don't need to worry about any of that. Brenda and I are handling everything." "I know, dear," I said, keeping my tone gentle, "and I appreciate it so much. It's just, I'm feeling a bit stronger now. I thought perhaps I could start looking at the paperwork again, to feel useful." I framed it as a need of my own, a fragile bid for relevance. It was a language he understood. His face softened into a mask of pity. "Oh, Mom." He reached across and patted my knee, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt deeply condescending. "You're still recovering. It's perfectly normal to feel a little confused and overwhelmed after everything you've been through." There it was, the gaslighting, so smooth, so practiced. I was not strong. I was confused. I was not capable. I was overwhelmed. "The finances are very complicated now," he continued, a vague and knowing look on his face. "With the estate and everything, it's a lot of new rules. It would just upset you. Trust me, we have it under control." "I see," I said. I did not argue. I simply sipped my tea and nodded. "Well, as long as you're sure." "I'm sure, Mom," he said, turning back to his game. The conversation in his mind concluded. But I had my answer. The defensiveness, the immediate redirection to my emotional state, the insistence on complexity. It was a fortress of lies, and he was guarding it desperately. I knew then that I would find no truth from him. I would have to find it for myself. My opportunity came a few days later. Brenda had converted my old sewing room into her personal office. It had been my sanctuary, a room filled with bolts of fabric, spools of thread in every color, and the quiet hum of my Singer machine. Now it was a sterile white box dominated by a large glass-top desk and a sleek, silver laptop. She was fanatical about her privacy, always locking the door when she left the house. But that afternoon she was in a rush, late for a yoga class. In her haste, she forgot. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway. My heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. This was not in my nature. I was not a snoop, a spy. I was a woman who respected locked doors. But the woman I used to be was gone, left behind in a cold garage. A new woman, a woman who needed answers, was now in her place. I pushed open the door to the sewing room. The air was cool, scented with Brenda's expensive perfume. Her laptop was on the desk, asleep but not shut down. I nudged the mouse pad. The screen flickered to life. She hadn't even password protected it. The carelessness of the arrogant. Her email was open. A wall of messages, most of them junk mail or confirmations from online stores. I felt a pang of guilt, an intruder in her digital life. I was about to turn away to abandon this foolish and demeaning exercise when a subject line caught my eye. It was an email from a real estate lawyer, someone I didn't recognize. The subject was simple and devastating. Refinalizing transfer on lake property. My breath caught in my throat. The lake property, our cabin, the place Richard and I had bought on our honeymoon, a tiny rustic A-frame on the shores of Lake Arrowhead. It was our sanctuary, the place we took Mark as a child, the place where Chloe had learned to swim. It was more than property. It was a vessel for our happiest memories. I clicked on the email. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely control the mouse. The body of the email was brief, formal. "Brenda, attached is the final copy of the recorded grant deed for your records. Congratulations again." I clicked on the attachment. A scanned document filled the screen, a grant deed. And there it was, in stark black and white. The property at Lake Arrowhead, transferred from the ownership of Richard and Eleanor Vance to Mark and Brenda Vance. I scanned down to the signatures. Mark's was there, bold and clear, and below it, my name, Eleanor Vance. Except it wasn't my signature. It was a clumsy, shaky imitation, a forgery, a crude and insulting one at that. My signature has a distinctive, looping E. This one was cramped and angular. It was the signature of a stranger. Then I saw the date on the document. It was dated 2 weeks after Richard's funeral. 2 weeks. While I was still numb with grief, walking through a fog of disbelief, they had been busy stealing my memories, forging my name, and congratulating themselves on their cleverness. The cold from the garage floor seemed to travel up my spine and settle deep in my heart. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was a calculated, cold-blooded theft. And I had the proof. I moved with a purpose I had not felt in years. My hands, which had been trembling, were now steady. The shock was gone, burned away by a cold, rising fury. I navigated to the print command, my fingers moving surely on the unfamiliar keyboard. I printed the email. I printed the forged deed. The whirring of the printer in the silent house sounded like a call to arms. I took the papers, warm from the machine, and folded them carefully, tucking them into the pocket of my housecoat. I closed the laptop, wiped the mousepad with the edge of my sleeve, and backed out of the room, pulling the door quietly shut behind me. I had crossed a line. I had become an investigator in my own life, and the first piece of evidence was a betrayal so profound it almost defied comprehension. I waited. The waiting was the hardest part. I had to maintain the facade of the fragile, forgetful old woman while this terrible knowledge burned inside me. I watched Brenda return from yoga, glowing and serene, and I had to smile and nod when she asked if I had a nice, quiet afternoon. I watched Mark come home from work, kiss her on the cheek, and I had to sit at the dinner table with them, listening to them talk about their day, about their friends, about their plans for the weekend, plans made with my money, in my house, while they slowly, methodically dismantled my life. Every polite good night, every false term of endearment, was a small, sharp splinter under my skin. I chose my moment. It was a Saturday. Brenda had gone to a day-long spa retreat with a friend, a much-needed escape. Mark was in the living room, ostensibly reading the newspaper but mostly scrolling through his phone. The house was quiet. I went to my room, retrieved the folded papers from my lingerie drawer, and walked back into the living room. My footsteps made no sound on the thick carpeting they had installed. I stood before him for a moment, watching him, a stranger with my son's face. He didn't notice me until I spoke. "Mark," I said. My voice was low, but it cut through the quiet room like a shard of glass. He looked up, startled. "Mom, you scared me." I didn't smile. I didn't reassure him. I walked to the coffee table, a solid oak piece Richard and I had bought at an antique fair 30 years ago, and I placed the papers on its polished surface. The email, the forged deed. I unfolded them and smoothed them out, then I stepped back and waited. He stared at the papers. His brow furrowed in confusion, then a slow wave of comprehension, followed by dawning horror, washed over his features. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. He looked from the papers to my face and then back again. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The newspaper slid from his lap and pooled around his feet. "Mom, what is this?" he stammered, his voice a choked whisper. "You know what it is," I said. My voice was unnervingly calm. "It's the deed to the lake house, the one you and Brenda stole. The one you forged my name on 2 weeks after your father died." The dam of his composure broke. "No, it's not. It's not like that," he sputtered, his hands fluttering in the air as if he could bat the truth away. "It's a misunderstanding, a legal thing for tax purposes. Dad wanted—" "Do not," I interrupted, and my voice was suddenly steel. "Bring your father into this. Do not use his memory to justify your greed." He flinched as if I had struck him. He looked at the papers again, at the irrefutable evidence of his crime, and something inside him seemed to collapse. He slumped back into the couch, his face in his hands. A dry, racking sob escaped him. The confession, when it came, was not a clean burst of truth, but a messy, self-pitying flood. It was worse than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the lake house, it was everything. He told me about Richard's diagnosis, a form of early-onset dementia, a detail the doctors had shared with Mark, who had insisted they not worry me with it. He had used his father's cognitive decline, his moments of confusion and vulnerability, as an opportunity. The power of attorney wasn't a precaution, it was a weapon. He and Brenda had started small, with reimbursing themselves for expenses. Then they had moved on to bigger things. They had systematically drained Richard's and my joint savings accounts, transferring the money into their own names. They had sold off a stock portfolio I didn't even know was gone. And the final, crushing blow, they had taken out a massive second mortgage on this very house, my home, forging my signature once again. The money had funded their new car, Brenda's designer wardrobe, their lavish lifestyle. They were living a lie, and the foundation of that lie was the ruin of my life. I listened to his litany of betrayals without expression. The pain was so vast, so absolute, that it was beyond any outward show of emotion. It was a physical sensation, a hollowing out. I felt as if the very structure of my past, the 47 years of love and work and sacrifice, was being systematically demolished before my eyes. My life with Richard, our shared dream, had been plundered by our own child. He saw my silence, my stillness, and mistook it for forgiveness, for the endless, elastic compassion of a mother. He got on his knees, crawling across the carpet to grab my hand. His tears were wet on my skin. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he wept. "We'll pay it back, I swear. We just got in over our heads. Please, please don't tell Brenda you know. It would destroy her. Please, Mom, forgive me." Forgive him. The word was an absurdity. It was like asking a burn victim to forgive the fire. I pulled my hand away from his grasp. I looked down at this weeping, broken man who had once been my little boy, and I felt nothing. The part of my heart that held love for him was a cauterized wound. It was a dead, numb space. I retreated to my room and closed the door. I did not lock it. There was nothing left for them to steal. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the sky darken. The emotional nadir wasn't a storm of grief. It was a complete absence of weather. It was a vacuum. My entire identity, wife, mother, matriarch, had been predicated on a lie. I had dedicated my life to a family that saw me not as a person, but as a resource to be exploited, an obstacle to be managed. The years of my life, the work of my hands, the love in my heart, it had all been invalidated, rendered meaningless. I felt a profound cosmic loneliness. I was not just alone in the house, I was alone in my own history. I sat there for a long time. Night fell. The house was silent. Mark had crept away, leaving me to my stillness. I don't know how many hours passed. I watched my own reflection in the dark glass of the window pane. I saw a pale, drawn old woman, her shoulders slumped, her eyes wide and empty. A victim. That's what they had made me. That's what he had begged me to remain for his sake, a quiet, forgiving victim who wouldn't make a fuss. And then, something happened. Deep in the hollowed-out space inside me, a tiny, hard ember began to glow. It was anger, a cold, pure, diamond-hard anger. It was not a hot, messy rage. It was a clarifying fire. It burned away the fog of grief and shock and pain, and in its place it left a terrible, beautiful clarity. The tears that had not come never came. The shaking stopped. My breathing, which had been shallow, deepened. I sat up straighter in my chair. The woman in the reflection seemed to do the same. I looked at her, at the lines on her face etched by years of laughter and worry, and I saw not a victim, but a survivor, a woman who had weathered storms before. This was just another kind of storm. The grief was over. The mourning for the son I thought I had, for the life I thought I'd built, was done. Crying was what they expected. Being broken was what they needed me to be. I would be neither. I would not be erased. I would not be silenced. In the profound silence of my room, I heard my own voice, clear and steady, as if it belonged to someone else. "Enough," it said, and in that one word was a promise. A reckoning was coming. The decision to act was not a thunderclap. It was a quiet click, like a lock settling into place. The path forward was no longer a tangled mess of pain and confusion. It was a straight, clear line. My first step was to restore the mask. The next morning, I was the same woman I had been the day before, quiet, withdrawn, a little sad. I was a better actor than they knew. I feigned a headache, kept to my room, and accepted the tray of toast and tea Mark brought me with a trembling hand, playing the part of the fragile matriarch he needed me to be. His relief was palpable. He thought he had weathered the storm. He thought my silence was the silence of capitulation. He was a fool. My second step was to seek out an ally. I needed someone outside the blast radius of my family's toxicity. I needed a friend. I told Mark and Brenda that I had a long overdue checkup with my doctor in the city. They were delighted. It was a sign of me taking an interest again, and it conveniently got me out of the house for a day. Mark even offered to drive me, an offer I gently refused. "No, dear," I said, patting his arm. "I think a little independence would be good for me." I'll take a taxi." I did not go to the doctor. My taxi took me to a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood I hadn't visited in years, to the home of Catherine Reed. Catherine and I had been friends since our children were in kindergarten together. She was a woman carved from granite, a pragmatist with a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. We had drifted apart after Richard died, my grief making me a poor companion, but I knew if there was one person who would give me the unvarnished truth, it was her. She opened the door, her face breaking into a warm smile that quickly faded into a look of concern as she took in my appearance. "Eleanor," she said, her voice soft. "My God, get in here." She led me to her sun-drenched kitchen, sat me down at her worn wooden table, and placed a mug of hot, strong coffee in my hands without a word. I drank it, letting the warmth seep into me, and then I told her everything. The garage, the condescension, the forged deed, the stolen money, the hollowed-out feeling of betrayal. I laid the ugly, sordid story out on the table between us. I did not cry. My voice was flat, methodical, a witness giving testimony. When I finished, the silence in the kitchen was profound. Catherine just looked at me, her gaze steady and fierce. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her hand was warm and strong. "That bastard," she said, her voice low and furious. "That greedy, selfish little bastard, and that wife of his, a viper." There was no pity in her eyes, only a righteous anger that mirrored my own. Then she squeezed my hand and a grim smile touched her lips. "Well," she said, "it's about damn time you got angry, Eleanor. Now, what are we going to do about it?" That "we" was the most beautiful word I had ever heard. Catherine listened to my nascent plan, nodding slowly. She didn't question my resolve. She reinforced it. "You need a lawyer," she said, standing up and walking to a small desk in the corner. "Not just any lawyer. You need a shark. Someone who won't be charmed by your son's crocodile tears." She scribbled a name and number on a piece of paper. "Arthur Miller. He's expensive, he's ruthless, and he specializes in exactly this kind of mess. He eviscerated my cousin's ex-husband in their divorce. He's perfect." My next stop was a gleaming office tower downtown. The law offices of Arthur Miller were on the 35th floor with panoramic views of the city. The space was intimidating, all glass and steel and quiet, expensive-looking art. Mr. Miller himself was a surprise. I had expected a slick, aggressive man in a pinstripe suit. Instead, I was shown into the office of a quiet, meticulous man in his late 50s, with kind eyes and a reassuringly calm demeanor. He looked more like a university professor than a shark. But as I began to speak, I saw the shift. His eyes sharpened. His calm became a focused, predatory stillness. He listened. He did not interrupt. He simply listened, his fingers steepled under his chin, his gaze never leaving my face. I gave him the same testimony I had given Catherine, but this time I had the document. I placed the copy of the forged deed on his vast mahogany desk. He picked it up, his examination of it brief but intense. He looked at the email printout. He asked me a series of short, pointed questions. Dates, names, amounts, if I could guess them. His questions were not emotional. They were surgical, designed to extract facts. When I was finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Mistress Vance," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight of authority. "Your son and his wife have committed multiple felonies, grand larceny, forgery, and what is legally defined as elder fraud. The case is, from a legal standpoint, exceptionally strong." He paused. "The question is not whether you can act. The question is, what is the outcome you desire?" I met his gaze. "I want it back," I said, my voice clear and firm. "Everything they took. The money, the property, my house. And I want them out of it. I want my life back." "And them?" he asked. "What do you want to happen to them?" I thought for a moment. The old Eleanor would have agonized over this, torn between justice and a mother's instinct. The new Eleanor did not hesitate. I want them to face the consequences of their actions, I said, whatever those consequences may be. A slow, thin smile touched Mr. Miller's lips. It was the smile of a shark who has just scented blood in the water. Very good, he said. Then we have a great deal of work to do. The weeks that followed were a master class in clandestine warfare. Mr. Miller was my general, and I was his most dedicated soldier. We operated in secret, building our case brick by brick. He hired a forensic accountant, a prim, terrifyingly efficient woman named Miss Peters, who, with my blessing, gained access to my banking history. I would meet her in quiet coffee shops, handing over old statements and checkbook registers I had unearthed from the attic. She dove into the numbers, her face lighting up with a kind of professional glee as she untangled the web of transfers and withdrawals. She followed the money trail from my accounts to theirs, to the car dealership, to the high-end department stores, to the travel agent who had booked their anniversary trip to Hawaii. Mr. Miller also engaged a private investigator, a former police detective named Frank, whose gruff exterior hid a meticulous attention to detail. Frank documented Mark and Brenda's life of luxury. He provided photographs of them dining at expensive restaurants, of Brenda leaving boutiques with armfuls of bags, of Mark's new, ridiculously expensive golf clubs. He even managed to get a sworn affidavit from the notary, whose stamp was on the forged deed, a man who tearfully admitted he had notarized the document without me being present as a favor to Mark, who had claimed his mother was too ill to travel. Each new piece of evidence was a confirmation, another layer of steel fortifying my resolve. The betrayal was deeper, more systematic, and more arrogant than I had even known. They had not just stolen from me, they had built a whole world on top of their lies, a world in which they were the deserving heroes, and I was a distant, senile afterthought. While they lived this lie, I continued to play my part. I was quiet, compliant, and increasingly forgetful. I would misplace my glasses. I would ask the same question twice. I would sigh and say I was tired. I let them see the woman they believed me to be, the woman they needed me to be, for their conscience to remain clear. Their complacency was my greatest weapon. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was about to give way. The reckoning was not just coming, it was here. The day was a Tuesday. I chose it for its sheer ordinariness. There were no holidays, no birthdays, no anniversaries to mar. It was just a Tuesday in October, crisp and clear. Mr. Miller had informed me that all our pieces were in place. The forensic accountant's report was a damning multi-hundred-page epic of greed. The private investigator's file was thick with photographs and affidavits. The district attorney's office, presented with a preliminary overview of the case, had already expressed significant interest. The legal petitions were drafted and ready to be filed. The plan for the day was a symphony of precision, and I was its conductor. At exactly 9 a.m., while I sat in my room sipping tea, Mr. Miller was filing the emergency motions with the court. The first was to immediately freeze all bank accounts, joint or otherwise, to which Mark and Brenda were signatories. The second was to contest the fraudulent transfer of the lake house deed and begin the process of returning it to my name. The third, and most immediately impactful, was a temporary restraining order and an eviction notice citing financial elder abuse and illegal occupation of my property. By 9:30 a.m., a judge had signed off on all of it. The gears of justice had begun to turn. My next call was to a locksmith. I had arranged it the day before. He was to arrive at precisely 3 p.m. to change every lock on the property, including the garage and the garden shed. My final call was to Chloe's school. I spoke to the principal, a woman I had met at a school function once, and explained that due to a family emergency, I would be picking Chloe up directly from her last class. I wanted her safe. I wanted her away from the fallout. The house was quiet. Brenda was at her weekly pottery class, molding clay into misshapen bowls. Mark was at work, likely staring at his computer, dreaming of his next big purchase. I moved through the house, My house one last time in its current configuration. I ran my hand along the back of Richard's armchair, which I had retrieved from the attic a week ago, claiming a fit of nostalgia. I looked at the photos on the mantelpiece, a gallery of happier times, of a family that had, perhaps, never truly existed. There was no sadness. There was only a sense of purpose, a calm finality. At 1 p.m., I sent a text message to both Mark and Brenda. "Please come home. I need to speak with you both about something important." The wording was deliberately vague, designed to pique their curiosity and perhaps a little alarm. Brenda texted back almost immediately. "In the middle of something, can it wait?" I replied with a single word. "No." Mark called. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound strange." "I am fine, Mark," I said. "Just be here in the living room, 1:30. I hung up before he could ask any more questions. They arrived within minutes of each other, bustling in with an air of annoyed impatience. Brenda was still wearing her clay-spattered apron. "Eleanor, what on earth is so important? You pulled me out of a firing." Mark looked worried, his face etched with a familiar, anxious guilt. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you sick?" They stood in the middle of the living room, looking at me where I sat in my usual chair. They were still in charge, still directing the action. They had no idea they were walking onto a stage that was no longer theirs. "Sit down," I said. My voice was not loud, but it had a new timbre, a resonance of command that made them both blink. They exchanged a confused glance, but they sat perching on the edge of the gray sofa they had chosen. I let the silence hang in the room for a moment, a heavy, weighted thing. I looked from my son's face to his wife's. I saw not family, but strangers, adversaries. "At 9 o'clock this morning," I began, my voice even and clear, "Mr. Arthur Miller, my attorney, filed a series of motions on my behalf. As of 9:30, all bank accounts bearing your names in connection with my assets were frozen." Brenda's mouth dropped open. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I ignored her and continued, my gaze fixed on Mark. "A petition has been filed to reverse the fraudulent transfer of the Lake Arrowhead property. A forensic accounting of the past 18 months has been submitted as evidence." I saw the blood drain from Mark's face. He understood the implications of that. "Furthermore," I said, my voice dropping a little, "a formal criminal complaint has been lodged with the district attorney's office detailing a pattern of forgery, theft, and financial elder abuse." Brenda let out a short, hysterical laugh. "This is insane. Eleanor, you're having some kind of breakdown. Mark, call her doctor." "And finally," I said, my voice cutting through her panic, "a judge has signed a temporary restraining order. You are to have no contact with me, and you are to vacate this property. The locks are being changed at 3 o'clock. You have—" I glanced at the grandfather clock in the hall, Richard's pride and joy. "Approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes to remove your personal belongings." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of total, catastrophic disbelief. Brenda stared at me, her face a mask of ugly confusion. Mark was shaking his head slowly, a low moan escaping his lips. "Mom, no, you don't mean this. This is a misunderstanding. We can fix this." "There's nothing to fix, Mark," I said. The dam of my composure finally broke, not with tears, but with a cold, hard truth. "You put me in the garage. You let your wife humiliate me in my own home while you stood by and did nothing. You stole from your father as he was dying. You stole my home, my savings, my security, and my memories. You did not do it in a moment of weakness. You did it systematically, day after day, with forethought and with malice." Brenda found her voice then, a shrill, venomous thing. "You ungrateful old bitch," she shrieked, lunging to her feet. "After everything we've done for you, taking you in, looking after you." "You took me in?" I asked, a genuine mirthless laugh escaping me. "This is my house. You were guests who overstayed their welcome and decided to rob the hostess." Mark was on his feet now, his face streaked with tears. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "I'm your son. Your only son. You can't do this to me, to us. I love you." I stood up, my old bones protesting but my spirit resolute. I looked at this man, this stranger who wore my son's face, and I felt a vast, cold, empty distance. There was no anger left. There was no pain. There was nothing. "My son," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "would not have done these things. My son loved and respected his father. My son would have cherished his mother. I don't know who you are, but you are not my son." I turned and walked towards the front door. "Mr. Miller's representatives will be here shortly to supervise your departure," I called over my shoulder. "I suggest you start packing." I didn't look back. I didn't want to see their faces contorted with rage and disbelief. I opened the front door, the door Richard had carried me through as a bride, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. A black town car was waiting at the curb, just as Mr. Miller had promised. As I got in, I saw a van from a One Locksmith's pull up behind it. The engine started and the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the house and the life I had known behind me forever. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of quiet, sterile rooms and conversations conducted through third parties. Mr. Miller had booked me into a residential hotel, a place of hushed corridors and anonymous comfort. My suite was spacious and clean, with a small kitchenette and a view of a tidy, uninspiring park. The silence here was different from the silence in my old house. It was not heavy with loss. It was light with possibility. It was the silence of a blank page. I did not follow the drama of Mark and Brenda's downfall obsessively. I received updates from Mr. Miller in his calm, measured tones. The eviction was, apparently, a scene of high drama. Brenda had become hysterical, refusing to leave, until the uniformed police officers, there to keep the peace, had gently but firmly escorted her to the curb. Mark had simply collapsed, sitting on the front steps with his head in his hands, a broken man amidst a small mountain of hastily packed suitcases and designer shopping bags. They were, for all intents and purposes, homeless. Their friends, the ones who had flocked to their lavish parties, suddenly did not return their frantic calls. The social status they had purchased with my money evaporated overnight. The legal consequences were swift and brutal. The evidence was so overwhelming that the district attorney proceeded with an almost gleeful efficiency. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable proof, the forensic accounting, the forged documents, the testimony of the coerced notary, the private investigator's detailed log of their expenditures, Mark's defense crumbled. Mr. Miller advised me that he had been offered a plea deal. He would plead guilty to several counts of fraud and forgery in exchange for a shorter sentence. He took it. The day he was sentenced, Mr. Miller called me. "7 years, Mistress Vance," he said. "With good behavior, he'll be out in 4. I felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even a flicker of pity. It was simply a fact, like a weather report. A storm had passed, and this was the damage assessment. Brenda, as a co-conspirator but not the primary actor, fared slightly better. She received 5 years of probation, a hefty fine she had no means to pay, and a permanent criminal record that would dog her for the rest of her life. She was ruined, not with the clean finality of a prison cell, but with the slow, grinding humiliation of a life stripped of all its props. During this time, the phone in my hotel suite rang occasionally with unfamiliar numbers. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, old neighbors, former friends of Mark and Brenda. They had heard rumors, fragmented and dramatic. Some called to express shock and offer sympathy. Others, braver or more foolish, called to plead on Mark's behalf. "He's your son, Eleanor," one cousin said, her voice thick with disapproval. "Blood is thicker than water." I would listen for a moment, and then I would hang up without a word. I owed them no explanation. My story was not for their consumption or judgment. My boundaries, once as porous as a sieve, were now walls of granite. I was done explaining myself. My emotional state was a strange and placid sea. I had expected to feel a vengeful joy, a triumphant, "I told you so." But there was none of that. The feeling was more akin to the quiet relief after a long, painful surgery. The diseased limb had been amputated. The process was brutal but necessary for survival. I felt a profound sense of distance from the person I had been, the woman who had sat in that garage. She was a figure in a story I had once read, a character whose pain I could remember but no longer feel. I did not feel happy, not in the way people usually mean it. I felt something far more precious. I felt at peace. The weight that had been settling on my chest for years was gone. I could breathe. The only person I spoke to directly, other than Catherine and my legal team, was Chloe. I had picked her up from school that day, taken her for ice cream, and explained in the simplest terms I could manage that there had been a serious problem at home, and that for a little while, things were going to be very different. I told her that her father had made some terrible mistakes with money and that he and Brenda would not be living in my house anymore. I did not give her the sordid details. She was a child, and he was still her father, but she was wise beyond her years. She listened, her young face serious, and when I was done, she simply said, "Are you okay, Nana?" The question was so pure, so selfless that it was the only thing that brought me close to tears in that whole ordeal. "I am now, my love," I told her, and it was the absolute truth. I made arrangements through Mr. Miller to ensure she was cared for, placed in the custody of her other grandparents, Brenda's parents, with a clear line of communication always open to me. My war was not with her. She was the one innocent in all of this. Months passed. The legal battles wound down. The house, my old house, was finally empty and silent, purged of their presence. Mr. Miller's team had overseen the removal of their remaining things, placing them in a storage unit for which they were now responsible. The house was mine again, free and clear. But when I thought of returning, I felt a deep and profound reluctance. The ghosts in that house were not just Richard's anymore. They were the ghosts of a happy family that never was, the ghost of a son I had lost long before he went to prison. It was not a home, it was a monument to a lie. And so I made another decision. I called Mr. Miller. "Sell it," I said. "Sell everything." A year after that terrible Thanksgiving, I was a different woman living in a different world. I sold the big house in the suburbs, the one that held 47 years of my life, and I did not look back. The proceeds, once Mr. Miller had clawed back every stolen penny from Mark and Brenda's seized assets, were substantial. I was, for the first time in my life, independently and unequivocally wealthy, but I had no desire for extravagance. The sight of Mark and Brenda's greed had cured me of any latent desire for luxury. I wanted simplicity. I wanted light. I wanted peace. I bought a small condominium in a quiet coastal town 100 miles from my old life. It was on the top floor with a wide balcony that overlooked the endless rhythmic expanse of the ocean. The rooms were filled with sunlight from dawn until dusk. I furnished it slowly, piece by piece, with things that I chose, things that brought me a quiet joy, a comfortable armchair for reading, not a designer statement piece, a small, sturdy wooden table for my meals, a bed with crisp, clean linens that I alone would sleep in. There was no gray. The walls were the color of cream, and I hung one painting, a seascape in brilliant blues and greens, on the main wall. The house was not heavy. It was light. I felt light. I rediscovered the woman I had been before I became a wife and a mother. I had forgotten she even existed. I started baking again, not for a crowd, but for the pleasure of it. The scent of fresh bread filled my small kitchen. I took up gardening on my balcony, coaxing herbs and bright red geraniums from pots of dark, rich earth. I joined a book club at the local library. I took long walks on the beach, the salt spray on my face, the cry of the gulls a constant comforting music. I built a new life from the ground up, a life that was entirely my own, on my own terms. My days fell into a gentle, predictable routine, and in that routine, I found not boredom, but a deep and abiding peace. Chloe was the one thread I kept from my old life. The trust I had established, managed by a neutral third party, ensured her education and her future were secure, untouched by the fallout of her parents' crimes. She was now in her first year of university, studying to be an architect. She visited me once a month. She would take the train down the coast, and I would meet her at the station. We would walk on the beach, collect shells, and talk. She never spoke of her father. I never asked. It was an unspoken pact between us. We looked forward, not back. She would tell me about her classes, her friends, her dreams of designing buildings filled with light and air. She would sit on my balcony, sketch in her notebook, and ask me questions about my life, about the books I was reading, about the world. In her eyes, I was not a relic, not an obligation, not a source of funds. I was Eleanor, a person with a story. Her presence in my new quiet life was a gift, a confirmation that true legacy is not about blood or money, but about love and respect, given freely and without condition. She was my family. The rest was just noise. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I sit on my balcony and watch the sun set over the water, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. I think about the woman who sat in that cold garage, a paper plate on her lap, and I feel a distant, gentle pity for her. She was so lost, so invisible. She did not know her own strength. I had to be broken down to my very foundations before I could find it. The journey from that garage to this balcony was a hard one, but I would not trade it. It taught me the difference between obligation and love, between what we are told we should be and who we truly are. It taught me that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you build, the one you choose, the one that chooses you back. I learned that forgiveness is not a requirement. It is a gift, and it should be given only to those who are worthy of it. Some betrayals are not simple mistakes. They are choices. They are a fundamental statement about who a person is. My son and his wife made their choices. They chose greed over love, lies over truth, themselves over everyone else. And I, in the end, made my choice too. I chose me. I chose to honor the life Richard and I built by refusing to let it be desecrated. I chose to reclaim my dignity, my peace, and my future. And I found that peace not in revenge, but in release. I released the anger, the pain, the son I thought I had, the life I thought I knew. I let it all go and watched it drift away on the tide. It is never too late. It is never too late to say enough. It is never too late to demand respect, to draw a line in the sand, to choose yourself. My new life is small and it is quiet, but it is mine. Every sunrise I watch from this balcony, every cup of tea I drink in my sunlit kitchen, every page of every book I read in my comfortable chair, it is all mine. And it is more than enough. It is everything.